Hey friends, Catherine Korostoff here from Research Rockstar, and today we're going to talk about data. And this time we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is secondary data. And the reason why it's one of my favorite topics is because it tends to get overlooked. People don't actually spend as much time on secondary data as they potentially could and benefit from. So I really enjoy making sure that people understand how to think about secondary data and all of its possible uses. So let's get right here started. A great context for thinking about when to use secondary data and all of its wonderful benefits is when you're thinking about kicking off a new project. So let's imagine that you've just been given a new market research project to understand customer behavior in the yogurt market. But let's imagine you've never done research on the yogurt market before. Well, how are you going to get started? You've been given a project to understand customer behavior. What's your first step? Well, the first thing we always want to do is leverage what already exists. So if there is any existing data, whether it's internal to the organization or from third parties, we want to get our hands on it. And when you're talking about a market the size of yogurt, there is actually a lot of data available. So I would say this is a classic example of where I'm going to start with some secondary data before I even think about whether or not I actually need to collect primary research data, whether it's in the form of surveys or focus groups or social listening or other data sources. So in this case, if I'm using my yogurt market example, what would the benefits be? What would I actually get out of doing secondary research as my first step? Well, one of the things that I'm going to get away with get from the secondary research is knowing whether or not I do in fact need to do primary research at all. It could be that when I start looking into this, that there's been enough published research, again, either internally to the organization or from third parties, where I might actually already have the answers to my questions. And that's going to be the fastest, most inexpensive option for me. So if I don't have to collect primary data, I'm not going to. So what we often find in professional market research and consumer insights work is that we will start with secondary data, see if we can answer the questions there, and then move on if we still have unanswered questions to a follow-up primary research phase. Secondary research, even if you don't think it's going to answer all of your burning questions, even a little secondary research can help you plan a primary research project. For example, it can help you find what the likely incidence levels are going to be so that you can get accurate quotes for any data collection costs. So if you are planning to do a survey, for example, you are going to need to find people who are going to take your survey about their yogurt behaviors. And when you go to a panel company, one of the things they're going to want is an incidence rate. That is, how hard is it going to be to find people who are going to be qualified for this study? Now, if you're just looking for general consumers, that's going to be really easy. However, if you go to the panel company and you say, I need people for this survey who eat yogurt at least 3 times a week, they're not necessarily going to know how common that is. So you're going to have to give them an incidence rate, and they are going to use that incidence rate to as one of the inputs to calculating the cost of your project. Is this a project that's going to be done for $3 a complete, or is this a project that's going to require $20 a complete or more, which can happen if you are going after a really hard to find population. So incidence rates can be informed by secondary research. Also, secondary research is a great way to create wonderful hypotheses. So if you are planning to do surveys or focus groups or other forms of primary research, you will often want to have some hypotheses. And if you collect some secondary data, you may actually learn enough about customer behavior and changes in customer behavior, or even predictions that people have published about customer behavior that will help you to identify really well-informed hypotheses. This is really common, by the way, where you're going to have projects as a professional market researcher or a professional customer insights person, where you're going to be assigned to markets where you don't have previous experience. And so using secondary research to inform your hypotheses is a really time efficient and very effective way to make sure that you're really creating the hypotheses that are going to deliver a great research project. So having great hypotheses can absolutely come from secondary research. You might find that somebody's published a report on the yogurt market talking about specific behaviors related to cooking with yogurt. And maybe maybe when you first started looking at the yogurt market, you weren't even thinking about cooking with it. You were thinking about eating it. Well, now you might have just discovered a whole bunch of really interesting hypotheses about potential demand drivers or potential product attributes, because now you've learned about how people cook with yogurt and why they cook with yogurt and so on from potentially a secondary study. The fourth important thing is that secondary research can help you think about market segmentation. And what your quota requirements would be or your screening criteria would be. So census data is an example of secondary data. And so if I'm doing a study on a particular market or in a particular geography, I want to use U.S. Census data to make sure that I understand what the size of that market is, how many people are in it, other aspects of the market in terms of if I'm doing the research in a specific geography, I want to look at maybe what the education levels are in that geography or household income or household size. All of those things can end up being really good information so that I'm designing a study where I have identified the right screening criterias and quota requirements. Secondary research is also great if you're planning on primary research where you have to do some competitive analysis. So maybe you're going to be doing some brand awareness or brand preferences, and you want to make sure that you've got all the right brands, especially in a market that is changed a lot in recent years, and yogurt is definitely a market that's had a lot of changes in recent years. Just take a look at the Greek yogurt segment as an example of that. I really want to make sure I've got all the right competitors identified. I don't want to overlook anything that could actually be important. So using secondary research, I might be able to find a report somebody's published on market share, for example, and the yogurt market. And that could be a great source of finding out who exactly the competitors are that we should be including in any brand awareness aided lists. Similarly, secondary research can also help make sure we've provided other important answer options outside of brands. So especially for those of you who are doing questionnaires, if you're doing survey research, one of the things we know is it's really important to make sure that we provide the right answer options. And I don't want to start choosing scales or putting lists of answer options together on a market I don't know anything about until I've really gotten up to speed. Because let's say in our yogurt example, maybe I am asking for questions about what criteria people use when they are choosing amongst different yogurt brands. And there may be some criteria that I, as a general consumer, never would have expected. And so by doing some secondary research, I might find out that, hey, a lot of people, when they're buying yogurt, they do look at for certain types of ingredients to be or not be in that yogurt container, or they are looking for specific yogurt container sizes or flavors or other attributes. So having access to secondary data is a great way to make sure that I have really done a great job of finding out what all the answer options are so that my questionnaire is going to be truly awesome. Now, those are, again, just some of the key benefits of using secondary research and some of the things that you can get out of it if you're doing a project for the first time, especially, when you're trying to get up to speed on a new market. But of course, business decision makers these days have access to a lot of different types of data. Thinking about data as primary or secondary is certainly one important aspect. But of course, we have access to a lot of different types of data sources these days. And I think it's really easy, because there are so many different sources and so many ways of talking about data, as this image shows, that it's easy to get really comfortable with one or two different types of data that you tend to use the most. If you haven't used secondary research in a while, I really encourage you to do so. There are way more options for secondary data than ever before, so you have tons of options, and the cost can literally be from $0 to thousands of dollars. So you definitely want to check that out. And by the way, Research Rockstar does have a class on Introduction to Secondary Research. In fact, we've got a session of it just starting in a couple of weeks from now. So if you have colleagues who really need to learn how to use secondary research and apply it and practice with it, in that course, they're going to learn about over 20 different types of secondary research so that they can really start to get hands-on and putting it to use. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share them. I really welcome more conversations about secondary research and other sources of data, here's my contact information. And if I can be of